On a raw Sunday in late February 1915, the brick mansion at the northwest corner of Fifth Avenue and 39th Street stands with its shutters half drawn against the traffic roar. Inside, only the basement and the first two floors are properly heated. A New York Times reporter will note that, in winter, only the first two floors and the basement are habitable, and that the Wendel sisters take their exercise after dark so that no prying eyes can spy down from neighboring buildings. In a front room, a curtain is edged a fraction wider, then carefully closed again. Below, carriage wheels clatter and motor horns intrude on a house that still has no telephone, no electric light, no modern conveniences that have transformed the city around it. It is a world held in deliberate delay, a domestic time capsule preserved through wealth and will. The gesture of drawing the curtain is practiced and precise, less about controlling sunlight than about keeping the world out. The cost of that privacy is not spoken aloud. By the mid-1850s, when German immigrant-turned-fur merchant John Daniel Wendel built his family house at the northwest corner of Fifth Avenue and 39th Street, the new thoroughfare was still a residential boulevard of brownstone mansions stretching northward from Washington Square, carrying the city's aspirations uptown away from the commercial districts clustered near the harbor. The location was strategic, close enough to established neighborhoods to be respectable, far enough north to be among the vanguard of development that would define Manhattan's future. John Daniel had arrived in America with little, built a successful fur trading business, and then pivoted to the occupation that would make the Wendel name legendary: real estate investment. He purchased lots and buildings with a philosophy that contemporary observers would later distill into a single principle: buy, hold, never sell. The strategy required patience, capital, and an almost religious faith that New York's northward expansion would eventually transform modest purchases into extraordinary wealth. His wife, Mary Ann Dew Wendel, brought to the marriage a different kind of pedigree, descent from an English family documented in Dew genealogies that traced lineage back through generations of respectable merchants and landowners. Together, they raised 8 children in the Fifth Avenue house: 1 son, John Gottlieb, and 7 daughters whose names reflected the family's social ambitions and European heritage: Mary Eliza Astor, Henrietta Dorothea, Rebecca Antoinette Dew, Augusta Astoria Stansbury, Josephine Jane Steinbeck, Georgiana G.R., and the youngest, Ella Virginia. On 21st November 1839, Mary Eliza had been born in Manhattan into a world where the Wendel fortune was already being carefully accumulated through real estate purchases in a city whose boundaries were expanding with each passing year. Contemporary property records and later genealogical research document the steady acquisition of lots, the collection of rents, the patient accumulation of paper wealth that would eventually place the family among New York's richest residents. The family rule, later summarized by a commentator in the Single Tax Review, was elegantly simple in its articulation. They made a rule never to sell and rarely to improve. This was not mere passivity but active strategy. While other landlords invested in renovations and improvements, seeking to maximize short-term rental income, the Wendels kept their buildings in basic repair but rarely upgraded them. The rents paid the taxes and allowed the purchase of more property. Rising New York real estate values did the rest, transforming patients into tens of millions of dollars without the need for active development or risk-taking. Inside the Fifth Avenue house, the children grew up in an atmosphere where wealth was understood not as something to be displayed, but as something to be preserved and protected. Frugality was not economic necessity, but family philosophy. Shutters were kept in good repair, as important to the household's self-presentation as the iron railings that line the front stoop. The physical barriers, walls, gates, shutters, curtains, created clear boundaries between the private family domain and the public street beyond. In the parlor, heavy drapes could be drawn against afternoon sun and curious eyes. In the dining room, meals followed German immigrant traditions mixed with American middle-class propriety, emphasizing substance over spectacle. The house was comfortable but not ostentatious, reflecting John Daniel's origins and his belief that wealth should be accumulated rather than consumed, invested rather than paraded. Land and privacy were the two pillars of the Wendel family fortune and philosophy, mutually reinforcing values that shaped how the children understood their place in New York society. They owned increasingly valuable property throughout Manhattan, yet lived quietly, almost invisibly, behind shutters that filtered the world into acceptable increments of light and observation. As other Gilded Age fortunes chased visibility in Newport summer colonies and European grand tours, investing in social capital through lavish entertaining and strategic marriages, the Wendells pursued a different strategy, investing instead in walls and curtains, in the architecture of withdrawal that would eventually become their most distinctive characteristic. When John Daniel Wendell died in 1876, control of the carefully accumulated estate passed to his only son, John Gottlieb Wendell, known as John G. The transfer of authority was absolute and unquestioned, following the patriarchal patterns typical of German American families in the period. The son inherited not just property, but the responsibility to maintain and expand what his father had built, to protect his unmarried sisters, and to ensure that the Wendell fortune passed intact to the next generation. By the 1880s, as Fifth Avenue's 400, the exclusive social elite whose membership was determined by Mrs. Caroline Astor's ballroom capacity, orchestrated elaborate balls, opera nights, and cotillions that marked the boundaries of acceptable society. The red brick Wendell House at 39th Street remained stubbornly old-fashioned in both appearance and operation. While neighboring mansions installed electric lighting, telephones, and modern plumbing, the Wendells continued with gaslight, relied on messengers rather than telephone operators, and maintained systems that had worked adequately in the 1850s and saw no reason for change. Newspaper profiles published after the family's eventual dissolution would describe John G. Wendell with a mixture of fascination and bemusement. The Times called him the Hermit of Fifth Avenue, noting his aversion not just to automobiles but to other modern improvements that were transforming urban life at an accelerating pace. His resistance to change was not mere eccentricity, but reflected a deeper philosophy, that the old ways had proven their worth, that innovation carried risks that prudence advised avoiding, that stability and predictability were virtues worth preserving, even at the cost of being considered behind the times. Inside the mansion, gaslight continued to cast its particular yellow glow across dining tables and sitting rooms long after neighboring houses had switched to the whiter, brighter illumination of electricity. Servants followed routines established decades earlier, their daily schedules and responsibilities changing little from year to year. The sisters' wardrobes, observers would later note, seemed frozen in the styles of their youth: high collars, long skirts, modest colors, as if fashion had stopped progressing somewhere in the 1870s, and the Wendell women saw no reason to acknowledge subsequent changes. The family maintained their established pattern of seasonal movement, spending winters in the Fifth Avenue house and summers divided between properties at Irvington-on-Hudson and Quogue on Long Island. These secondary residences offered relief from city heat and some variation in routine, but they operated under the same principles as the urban house: privacy maintained, expenses controlled, outsiders kept at careful distance. The houses were substantial enough to be comfortable but never showy, their furnishings adequate but not luxurious, their gardens tended but not elaborate. In an era when calling cards, opera box subscriptions, and Newport cottages signaled social status and aspiration, when visibility in society columns confirmed one's place in the hierarchy, the Wendells declined most invitations and issued few of their own. They did not maintain an opera box at the Academy of Music or later at the Metropolitan Opera House. They did not summer in Newport among the Vanderbilts and Astors. They did not participate in the elaborate rituals of morning calls and afternoon teas that structured the social lives of other wealthy families. Their absence from society lists and event reports became its own kind of presence, a notable gap that observers filled with speculation, rumor, and increasing curiosity. Why did one of Manhattan's wealthiest families live so quietly? What secrets did those closed shutters conceal? Were the sisters content with their circumscribed lives, or were they somehow prevented from participating in the broader social world their wealth should have guaranteed them access to. Contemporary observers interpreted the Wendels' withdrawal in various ways: as admirable frugality and old world modesty, as peculiar eccentricity bordering on reclusiveness, as evidence that excessive wealth without proper social guidance produced strange distortions of normal family life. The truth, as later archival research would suggest, was probably more complex: a mixture of John G.'s controlling personality, the sisters' internalized values of privacy and modesty, genuine preference for quiet routines, and the way family patterns established in one generation became increasingly difficult to break in subsequent ones. In a culture that increasingly equated visibility with worth, where being seen at the right places with the right people confirmed one's social value, the deliberate choice to remain unseen was already a kind of defiance. But defiance requires agency, requires conscious choice, and the question of how much the Wendell sisters chose their isolation versus how much it was imposed upon them would become central to understanding their story. The same rules that protected the estate from dissolution and preserved the family fortune intact also narrowed every path the daughters might have taken toward independent lives, marriages, or social engagement beyond the house's thick walls. By the 1890s, New York newspapers and society magazines tracked with voyeuristic fascination the phenomenon of American heiresses sailing to Europe to become dollar princesses. Wealthy young women whose substantial dowries rescued debt-burdened aristocratic estates in exchange for titles that conferred social prestige American money alone could not purchase. Between 1870 and 1914, historians estimate that more than 100 British aristocrats, including 6 dukes, married American women whose fortunes funded estate restoration, debt payment, and the maintenance of aristocratic lifestyles that agricultural revenues could no longer support. The pattern was well established and widely understood. Railroad heiresses like Consuelo Vanderbilt, mining fortunes like the Goulds, banking wealth like the Leiter family, all crossing the Atlantic to become duchesses, countesses, and ladies whose titles appeared in Debrett's Peerage, and whose portraits were painted by John Singer Sargent. The transactions were documented in marriage settlements that specified exactly how many millions would flow from American banks to European estates, how income would be divided, what provisions would be made for children and widowhood. Names like Vanderbilt, Gould, and Jerome filled society pages and portrait galleries, their daughters' weddings covered in exhaustive detail by newspapers that understood readers' appetite for stories about wealth meeting titles, New World energy revitalizing Old World elegance, American ambition purchasing European pedigree. These young women became famous, their choices debated, their marriages analyzed as both romantic achievements and commercial transactions depending on the observer's perspective. At 44244 Fifth Avenue, however, the 7 Wendell sisters existed in a parallel universe to this glittering transatlantic marriage market. They did not make debuts into society, did not cross the Atlantic in search of titled husbands, did not appear in ball photographs or wedding announcements. They were not painted by fashionable portraitists, not featured in society columns, not invited to the dinners and receptions where appropriate young men were introduced to marriageable young women under the watchful eyes of matchmaking mothers. A writer for Drew University magazine, drawing on research in the Wendell family papers archived at the university after the family's eventual dissolution, described their home as an antiquated house of mystery amid the cacophonous commerce of Midtown Manhattan. The phrasing captures both physical reality, an old-fashioned house surviving in a neighborhood increasingly dominated by commercial development, and social mystery. Wealthy women living invisibly in a city that thrived on visibility and social performance. The same article offered a harsher interpretation of the sisters' situation, stating that they were starved of society by a tyrannical brother who insisted they remain unmarried and isolated, forcing them to cuddle lapdogs instead of sweethearts, to find companionship in pets rather than the husbands and children that marriage would have provided. Whether this characterization reflects the sisters' own feelings or later observers' projection of what they should have felt remains unclear. The archive preserves remarkably little direct testimony from the women themselves about their desires, regrets, or satisfactions. While other heiresses of their generation rehearsed curtsies for presentations at European courts, practiced the precise angles and depths required when greeting queens and princes, the Wendel's performance was quieter and more constrained. Shutters drawn against casual observation, walks taken at hours when streets were empty and curious neighbors safely inside. A social presence marked more by what it withheld than what it displayed. In the portrait gallery of Gilded Age womanhood, the visual and documentary record of how wealthy young women lived, married, and exercised what limited agency their era permitted, the Wendell sisters occupy a nearly empty frame. There are few photographs, fewer personal letters, almost no first-person testimony about their inner lives, hopes, or disappointments. The emptiness itself becomes meaningful, suggesting not merely historical accident, but systematic erasure. The way lives lived entirely within domestic walls leave fewer traces than lives that ventured into social spaces where observation and documentation occurred. The contrast with their dollar princess contemporaries is stark and instructive. Consuelo Vanderbilt's forced marriage to the Duke of Marlborough produced memoirs, correspondence, newspaper coverage, and historical analysis. Anna Gould's marriages to French aristocrats left legal documents, society reporting, and biographical material. These women's lives, however constrained by family ambition and social expectation, unfolded in spaces where observation left records that historians could later recover and interpret. The Wendell sisters, by contrast, lived in deliberate obscurity. Their wealth should have guaranteed visibility, should have made them subjects of social reporting and biographical interest. Instead, it funded the architecture of their disappearance, the shutters, the servants who enforced privacy, the controlled routines that minimized contact with the world beyond family walls. They owned some of Manhattan's most valuable property, but appeared in public record primarily through legal documents, property deeds, tax assessments, probate files. In a society that increasingly defined women's worth through marriage and social performance, through the ability to navigate drawing rooms and make advantageous matches, the Wendell sisters represented a different possibility. Women whose wealth insulated them from the marriage market, but did not free them from constraint. They did not need to marry for financial security, but neither were they permitted to imagine lives beyond the family house. Their brothers' control, expressed through allowances and rules rather than physical force, proved just as effective as any locked door. To understand how they arrived at such isolation, how 7 wealthy women in the heart of Manhattan came to live like recluses in a house without telephone or electric light, requires examining what passed for education within the Wendell household. The lessons taught not by hired governesses, but by daily example, by the rules that governed every aspect of domestic life, by the architecture of control that family wealth made possible to construct and maintain. For many elite American girls in the late 19th century, the passage from childhood to young womanhood meant a carefully structured educational program designed to prepare them for their expected roles as society hostesses, wives, and mothers. Governments taught French, German, and Italian. Music masters provided instruction in piano, voice, and occasionally harp or violin. Dancing teachers drilled students in the intricate steps of waltzes, quadrilles, and the other ballroom. Performances that social occasions required. Some families sent daughters to exclusive finishing schools like Miss Porter's in Farmington, Connecticut, an institution established in 1843 whose mission was explicitly to train girls in academic learning, moral values, social skills, and music and art appreciation, a curriculum that balanced intellectual development with the social accomplishments considered essential for women of their class. Days at such schools were scripted around piano practice, French dictation, drawing lessons, and the subtle arts of making and receiving social calls, accepting dance cards, managing household staff, and presiding over dinner tables where conversation was expected to be intelligent but not too serious, engaging but never controversial. The Wendell sisters left few records of formal schooling in their family papers. No school enrollment documents survive in the archives at Drew University that received the family papers after Ella's death. No letters home from boarding schools, no report cards, no certificates of accomplishment that would document structured education outside the family home. This absence is itself significant. It suggests that whatever education the girls received took place primarily within the house at Fifth Avenue, supervised by their mother and possibly by hired tutors whose names and tenures were not considered worth preserving in family records. What evidence does survive in the Wendel family papers suggests competent literacy, careful handwriting, and religious vocabulary. Letters written by the sisters in later life demonstrate grammatical correctness and organized thought. Their wills, drafted in consultation with attorneys but reflecting their own instructions, use precise legal language and show clear understanding of property and inheritance. They could read, write, manage accounts, and handle the business correspondence that property ownership required. Whatever formal education they received accomplished these functional goals adequately. But the most enduring lessons the Wendell sisters learned came not from books or tutors, but from the household regime their father established and their brother continued. Frugality despite wealth, privacy despite prominence, withdrawal despite opportunity. These were not lessons explicitly taught in the sense of formal instruction, but rather patterns absorbed through daily observation and reinforcement. The way their mother managed the household on a budget far below what the family's wealth would have permitted. The way their father avoided social obligations and preferred quiet evenings at home to fashionable entertainments. The way visitors were discouraged, invitations declined, curtains kept closed, where other young women of their class practiced posture in mirrored salons, learning to move gracefully under the observation of teachers and fellow students who would critique every gesture. The Wendells learned a different discipline, not how to be seen, but how to remain unseen, drawing a curtain carefully so that no gap admitted too much street view, declining an invitation with phrasing that closed off further inquiry, moving through the house in ways that minimized visibility from windows. These became, in effect, their deportment exercises, the physical education that prepared them not for social performance but for social absence. The contrast with standard elite girls' education of the period is instructive. Contemporary etiquette manuals and school prospectuses emphasize movement outward into society. How to enter a ballroom, how to accept an introduction, how to navigate complex social hierarchies with grace. The Wendell household taught opposite lessons: how to avoid entering social spaces, how to deflect introductions, how to construct barriers that kept hierarchy at a distance because the sisters never occupied a position within it. One can imagine the daily reinforcement of these lessons. A sister moving toward a window to look at the street, called back by her mother's gentle reminder about privacy. A casual mention of a neighbor's invitation met with her father's or later her brother's quiet disapproval. The gradual internalization that the world beyond the house was dangerous, unpredictable, best observed from behind barriers that could be controlled and maintained. As the sisters came of age, as they moved through their teens and 20s and into their 30s without the debuts and courtships that mark their contemporaries' transitions to adulthood, the curriculum tightened further. It was not merely society they were kept from, but the very possibility of ordinary acquaintance. The calling cards that other women used to build networks of friendship and potential courtship, that system of pasteboard rectangles left on silver trays to signal interest in continued acquaintance, functioned differently in the Wendell household. Or rather, they ceased to function at all. By the 1890s, John G. Wendell's expectations for his sister's behavior had hardened into what newspaper accounts would later describe as explicit decrees, rules that governed not just their social participation, but their entire mode of existence. One reporter, writing after the family's story became public, summarized the regime starkly. John frowned on marriage for his sisters and decreed they should stay out of society, live in the simplest possible style, and wear the fashions of their youth. The phrasing suggests both the absoluteness of his authority and its peculiar focus on preventing change. The sisters should not merely avoid extravagance, but actively embrace simplicity. They should not simply dress modestly, but wear styles that were already decades out of date by the 1890s, making them visibly different from their contemporaries, marking them as outside the normal flow of social time. Contemporary observers noted the sisters' appearance with a mixture of sympathy and judgment. They received allowances from John that outsiders called stingy, sums insufficient to maintain the wardrobe and lifestyle their wealth should have permitted. They were occasionally spotted on 6th Avenue, not fashionable 5th Avenue where their house stood, but the more commercial, less elite parallel street, shopping for bargains in stores that catered to middle-class customers rather than wealthy families. They appeared in what witnesses described as shabby clothes, garments worn beyond the point when fashion or even simple wear would normally dictate replacement. The Drew University magazine account adds darker speculation to these observations, suggesting that the sisters slipped into spinsterhood, and perhaps it was whispered insanity. The linking of unmarried status with mental instability was common in the period, reflecting broader cultural anxieties about women who failed to follow the expected life script of marriage and motherhood. Whether any of the sisters actually suffered from mental illness or whether their unconventional lifestyle was simply interpreted through that lens by observers seeking to explain behavior that violated social norms remains unclear from surviving evidence. In the elaborate social system of the Gilded Age, the calling card functioned as a crucial tool for building and maintaining social networks. The ritual was precisely choreographed. A woman would leave her card when visiting another woman's house. If the hostess was at home and wished to receive the visitor, the card would be collected and the visit would proceed. If the hostess was not receiving, the card would be left on a silver tray in the entrance hall, signaling that a visit had been attempted and now required a return card or visit to complete the social circuit. These small rectangles of pasteboard, engraved with names and sometimes addresses, served as passports through elite social space. They opened doors, initiated acquaintances, and built the networks through which women of this class exercised what limited social and economic power their world permitted. A woman with an extensive collection of calling cards from the right families possessed social capital that could be deployed for various purposes, making introductions, organizing charitable events, arranging suitable marriages for children. At the Wendel house, however, this system broke down entirely. According to a New York Times profile published in 1915, callers were rarely admitted to the house, and when cards were left, calls were never returned. This was not mere breach of etiquette, but active refusal of the social system itself. Each unreturned card was a severed connection, a potential friendship or acquaintance that would not develop, a path toward the broader social world that was deliberately closed off. The social cost of such refusal would have been immediate and cumulative. Other families, finding their cards unreturned, would stop attempting contact. The Wendels would gradually disappear from the mental maps of who was connected to whom, who could be invited to gatherings, who might be called upon for social or charitable purposes. The isolation would become self-reinforcing as fewer people attempted contact. The sisters would have fewer opportunities to practice even basic social skills, making any eventual venture outside the house more difficult and anxiety-provoking. For the sisters themselves, the experience of unreturned calls and declined invitations must have carried complex emotional weight. Did they long to accept invitations to participate in the social world their wealth should have granted them access to? Or had they so thoroughly internalized their brother's rules that isolation felt safer than exposure, withdrawal more comfortable than engagement? The archive provides no clear answers, but the pattern suggests that whether initially chosen or imposed, the isolation eventually became habitual, the known routine preferable to the uncertainties of change. When one sister finally tried to challenge these rules directly, to assert her own desires against family authority, the response would demonstrate just how far John G.'s control extended and how the language of mental incapacity could be deployed to prevent women from exercising independence even when they were legally entitled to their own property and decisions. On 22 August 1900, two women, Mrs. F. W. Mack and Mrs. Morris J. Sullivan, identified in newspaper accounts as friends of Georgiana Wendel, traveled from Manhattan to the family's summer estate at Irvington-on-Hudson, a property overlooking the Hudson River that the Wendels used for seasonal retreat from city heat. The visit was not casual social calling, but a concerned attempt to verify Georgiana's well-being after communications with her had become difficult or impossible. What the visitors found alarmed them sufficiently that they later provided sworn testimony to authorities. According to their account published in the New York Times, they were not allowed to have an interview with Miss Wendel, although she spoke to them from an open window. Georgiana appeared at an upper-story window close enough to converse, but separated by glass and distance, unable or prevented from coming downstairs to greet her visitors properly at the door, as social convention and basic hospitality would dictate. The women believed, they told investigators, that Georgiana is restrained of her liberty by her relatives. The phrasing was careful but clear. This was not voluntary seclusion but imposed confinement, not Georgiana's choice to avoid visitors, but her family's choice to prevent her from seeing them. The image preserved in this brief newspaper account is precise and troubling. A woman at a window, able to speak but not to come down, visible but inaccessible, her voice carrying across the yard while her body remains trapped behind walls and family authority. At Irvington, as at the Fifth Avenue house, the management of thresholds, shutters, doors, gates, windows, governed not just privacy but freedom of movement, determining where the sisters could go and whom they could see. Meanwhile, at the city house, contemporaneous newspaper descriptions painted a domestic regime characterized by deliberate discomfort and restricted activity. The 1915 Times account, compiled from multiple sources familiar with the household, noted that the residents had no telephone and no electric lighting, relying instead on gaslight and messenger services that had been standard in the 1860s but were increasingly archaic by the turn of the century. The old coal furnace does not carry heat well above the second floor, making upper floors essentially uninhabitable during winter months, confining the sisters to a smaller and smaller portion of their own house, as weather dictated. Outside, in the narrow side yard that ran along 39th Street, grass and weeds grew unchecked. The Times noted that the turf had not been cut in 30 years, a detail that suggests not poverty — the family could easily have afforded gardeners — but a deliberate choice to maintain no more than absolutely necessary, to spend nothing on appearances, to let the property decline toward shabby dignity, rather than investing in maintenance that would be visible from the street. After dark, when neighboring buildings' lights were extinguished and prying eyes could no longer observe from windows or sidewalks, the sisters took their exercise in this overgrown yard. The Times reporter described the practice matter-of-factly. So that no prying eyes can spy down from neighboring buildings, the sisters take their exercise in this limited private space. The restriction was presented as the sisters' own preference for privacy, but the pattern suggests something more confining, that even the simple act of walking outdoors required darkness and isolation, that their bodies moving through space was something to be hidden, that fresh air and exercise were permissible only under conditions that ensured invisibility. What contemporaries often described as eccentricity, the outdated technology, the unkempt grounds, the nighttime exercise, can also be read as pedagogy, a daily schooling in the idea that the outside world was dangerous, observation was intrusion, and safety lay only behind walls that family wealth maintained and family authority enforced. Each day spent in these conditions reinforced lessons about appropriate behavior, proper boundaries, and the dangers of exposure that justified continued withdrawal. The restriction of heat to lower floors in winter had practical consequences beyond mere discomfort. It meant the sisters spent cold months in even closer quarters, unable to retreat to private rooms upstairs, forced into constant proximity in the few heated spaces. It meant visitors, if any were admitted, would see the family living in ways that contradicted their wealth, raising questions about why such a rich family lived in such relative privation. It meant that the house itself became less livable with each passing year, as systems aged and were not updated. as standards of comfort rose around them, while their own remained frozen in an earlier, more austere era. Against this regime of control, surveillance, and calculated restriction, Georgiana's attempt to reach out to friends, to maintain connections beyond family walls, took on the character of resistance. Her next move, appealing to legal authorities for protection, would prove both an act of self-defense and a harsh lesson in the limits of women's legal agency in an era when male relatives' authority over female family members remained substantial and courts were often reluctant to intervene in what were considered private family matters. On 6 September 1900, following the formal complaint filed by Georgiana's concerned friends, a writ of habeas corpus was obtained from New York courts ordering that Georgiana Wendel be brought before a judge to be examined as to her mental condition. The legal mechanism was ancient. Habeas corpus, literally, you shall have the body, required that authorities produce a person being held to determine whether their detention was lawful. Its deployment in this case reflected serious concerns that Georgiana was being improperly confined by her family without legal justification. When Georgiana did not appear at the scheduled court hearing in Manhattan, the matter escalated. Judge Smith Lent traveled to the Irvington estate to conduct proceedings there, bringing the formal apparatus of law into the private space where the Wendel family had long exercised authority without external oversight or challenge. What transpired during that examination, preserved in contemporary newspaper accounts and later referenced in Drew University's collection of Wendel family materials, revealed the stakes of the conflict. Georgiana testified directly to Judge Lent that she was restrained of her liberty by her brother, John G. Wendel, who wanted to get her money. The accusation was explicit and serious. Not that John was protecting a mentally incompetent sister, as he would claim, but that he was deliberately confining her to maintain control over her share of the family fortune. Under their father's will, each child had inherited property and assets. If Georgiana gained independent access to her inheritance, she could live where she chose, see whom she wished, and potentially hire attorneys to challenge how the estate was being managed. John's attorneys mounted a defense that was standard in such cases. They argued that Georgiana was incompetent to manage herself and affairs by reason of loss of memory and understanding. The language of incompetence served multiple legal functions. It justified family control over her property, explained her desire to leave as evidence of impaired judgment, and positioned John as protective guardian rather than controlling jailer. Most damningly, John testified under oath that he had not seen his sister for nearly 2 years, despite living in the same household or moving between the same seasonal properties. The admission revealed the degree of separation maintained within the family. Siblings who shared a house but did not share space or time, who lived parallel lives under the same roof without meaningful contact or communication. After hearing testimony from both sides and consulting with medical experts brought by John's legal team, Judge Lent issued his ruling. Georgiana was undoubtedly suffering from delusional insanity. The verdict employed legal and medical vocabulary to transform a property dispute into a medical diagnosis, to reframe a woman's resistance to family control as evidence of mental illness requiring continued supervision. The legal vocabulary, incompetent, delusional, insanity, functioned as a kind of social etiquette in harsher form, a language that defined who could speak for themselves and who must be spoken for, who possessed agency and who required guardianship. In an era when women's independent action was often pathologized, when desires that conflicted with family or male authority could be interpreted as symptoms of hysteria or madness, Georgiana's attempt to claim her own money and freedom became evidence of the very incapacity her brother alleged. The case reveals the architecture of legal control that reinforced domestic authority. John did not need physical locks to keep Georgiana confined. He needed only the cooperation of legal and medical systems willing to accept that a woman's resistance to male family control indicated mental illness rather than legitimate grievance. The diagnosis of insanity served the same function as the closed shutters and unreturned calling cards. It isolated Georgiana from social support, from legal remedies, from any avenue toward independence. In a family where male authority and property management were so thoroughly intertwined, where John controlled not just his own inheritance, but effectively supervised his sister's shares through his role as estate executor and family patriarch, a sister's demand for direct access to her own fortune could not be tolerated as simple financial dispute. It had to be reframed as evidence of incapacity, as delusion requiring correction, as a problem to be solved through medical diagnosis and legal guardianship, rather than through negotiation or acknowledgement of her property rights. Yet Georgiana's story did not end with Judge Lent's ruling, though it easily might have. Many women declared insane by family members in this period spent the rest of their lives in institutions or under guardianship, their property managed by relatives, their voices silenced by medical and legal authority. That Georgiana would find a way to overturn the verdict and even temporarily escape her brother's control speaks to her persistence and perhaps to the ambiguous nature of her alleged insanity, clear enough to convince a judge in one hearing, but questionable enough to be challenged and overturned through continued legal action. By September 1901, through legal maneuvering, whose exact details remain somewhat obscure in surviving records, Georgiana had succeeded in having the verdict of insanity overturned on the ground of irregularity, a legal technicality suggesting problems with how the original hearing was conducted or how evidence was presented. The reversal must have required hiring her own attorneys, finding witnesses willing to testify on her behalf, and navigating a legal system that was generally sympathetic to male family authority but could be compelled to follow proper procedures. With the insanity verdict vacated, Georgiana sued her brother John, claiming that he had not distributed their father's estate according to the will's terms, that he had mismanaged funds, and that she was entitled to her full inheritance free from his supervision. The lawsuit represented an escalation of the conflict from questions about her mental capacity to direct challenges about property and authority. If she could prove financial mismanagement, she might gain complete independence from family control, taking her share of the estate and establishing her own household according to her own preferences. For a time, she escaped to Europe, that traditional refuge for wealthy Americans seeking distance from domestic constraints, a place where geographic separation provided both physical freedom and social anonymity. Later reports noted that she was still living abroad in 1907, suggesting years spent away from the Fifth Avenue house and Irvington estate, years presumably spent in hotels and rented accommodations, supported by whatever funds she had managed to access or that were provided to her through settlement negotiations. European exile was a complicated form of freedom. She was away from direct family supervision, able to move and associate as she chose, no longer confined to darkened houses with unkempt yards and restricted visiting hours. But she was also disconnected from familiar surroundings, from whatever friends she might have cultivated, from the city where her family's property holdings gave her at least theoretical claim to status and resources. The lawsuit she had filed presumably continued through attorneys and courts in New York, her absence from proceedings both protecting her from pressure and limiting her ability to personally advocate for her interests. Then, in 1907, according to the same newspaper accounts, a reconciliation was effected. The phrasing is notably passive, not that Georgiana chose to return, or that John invited her back, but that some settlement was arranged through intermediaries or attorneys that both parties could accept. The Times noted that Miss Georgiana returned willingly to the family roof, the word willingly doing significant work to suggest that her return was her own choice rather than the result of financial pressure, exhausted legal options, or simply the difficulty of maintaining European exile indefinitely. Her actions during those years left a paper trail that survived in various archives, writs and court filings in New York legal records, habeas corpus petitions, correspondence with attorneys, financial documents tracing payments and settlements. These materials, later collected among the Wendel family papers at Drew University and referenced in newspaper accounts after the family's later dissolution, attests to a woman who for nearly a decade resisted her assigned role as silent spinster and dependent sister. But the story ends not with a publicly celebrated legal victory, not with an independent household or career outside family control, but with a return to the same rooms under essentially the same rules. Whatever settlement was reached apparently required her to resume residence with her siblings, to accept John's continued authority over estate management, to return to the rhythms of life behind shuttered windows and closed doors. The path Georgiana traced from window to courtroom to transatlantic steamship and back again maps the narrow corridor of choice available even to a wealthy woman in the early 20th century. She had property rights on paper, inheritance guaranteed by her father's will, and sufficient resources to hire attorneys and live abroad for years. But translating those legal and financial assets into actual independence proved extraordinarily difficult. Family authority, social convention, and legal structures that favored male control over female autonomy all conspired to make sustained resistance nearly impossible to maintain. If marriage was the standard exit route for women of Georgiana's class and era, the path through which daughters left their fathers' houses to establish new households under their husband's authority, the Wendel sisters' story shows how even that option could be tightly managed when family control over property was at stake. John's violent opposition to Rebecca's eventual marriage, his discouragement of church attendance where sisters might meet potential suitors without supervision, his enforcement of isolation that prevented the social mixing from which courtships normally developed, all worked to ensure that marriage would not redistribute the Wendel fortune or dilute family control over the accumulating real estate empire. Around 1912, when Rebecca Antoinette Dew Wendel was in her late 60s, she became the only sister to marry. Her husband was Luther Arthur Swope, a Lutheran clergyman whose profession suggested respectability, but whose relative financial status meant he was unlikely to demand large settlements or substantial dowry that might drain the family estate. The marriage took place despite what the New York Times would later describe as John's violent opposition, phrasing that suggests intense conflict over Rebecca's decision to exercise this traditional form of female agency and autonomy. The circumstances of the marriage remain somewhat mysterious in surviving sources. How Rebecca met Swope, whether theirs was a late-blooming romance or an arrangement providing her with some measure of independence, what negotiations occurred over property and finances, these details were not preserved in ways accessible to later historians. What is documented is that the marriage occurred and that it produced significant family tension, marking a rare instance where one of the sisters successfully defied John's control over their lives. The marriage, solemnized when Rebecca was far beyond typical childbearing years, did not produce heirs. This was perhaps reassuring to John and the other sisters, since children would have complicated property arrangements and potentially created claims on Rebecca's share of the estate that would have weakened family control. Without children, Rebecca's eventual property would return to her siblings according to inheritance patterns that kept wealth within the family, rather than dispersing it to a husband's relatives or to a new generation outside the Wendel line. The marriage functioned as a test of family rules and boundaries. Could a Wendel sister marry and remain part of the family system? Could she maintain her place in the property-sharing arrangements while acknowledging a loyalty and relationship outside the sibling group? The answer, as demonstrated by what happened next, was technically yes, but with severe restrictions. The New York Times noted that, thereafter, John Wendel discouraged his sisters from going to church, a detail that might seem tangential but reveals the logic of control. If Rebecca met Swope at church or through religious social networks, then church attendance represented a point of vulnerability in the isolation system. Religious spaces brought people together in ways that were socially sanctioned and difficult for families to prevent entirely without appearing irreligious or controlling. A woman could reasonably insist on her right to attend Sunday services, to participate in church committees and charitable activities, to fulfill religious obligations that were considered proper and indeed expected of respectable women. By discouraging church attendance after Rebecca's marriage, John sought to close the loophole she had exploited, to prevent his other sisters from following her example by meeting men in religious settings that provided some cover for social interaction. he could not completely prohibit without seeming tyrannical. The restriction reveals how thoroughly the isolation regime operated. Even religious devotion became suspect if it created opportunities for unsupervised social contact, particularly with men who might become suitors. In the broader context of Gilded Age marriage patterns, where extensive negotiations over marriage settlements and dowries often redistributed, substantial fortunes, where young heiresses brought millions of dollars into marriages that funded everything from European estate restoration to American political careers, the Wendel's approach was diametrically opposite. Marriage was not a mechanism for deploying wealth strategically, for creating alliances between families, for gaining social position or political influence. Instead, it was a threat to be minimized, controlled, and when it could not be prevented entirely, managed to ensure it posed no danger to the integrity of the estate. Rebecca's late marriage, carefully bounded, childless, apparently not requiring substantial financial settlement, represented the only form of matrimony the Wendel system could tolerate, one that changed legal status without changing property arrangements, that provided some personal satisfaction without threatening family financial structure, that acknowledged traditional female roles without disrupting the accumulation strategy that defined the family's approach to wealth. The marriage also highlights the paradox of the Wendell sisters' situation. They possessed property rights under their father's will, had legal claim to their inheritances, and could theoretically have married, established independent households, and lived according to their own preferences. But doing so required overcoming not just John's disapproval, but the entire structure of habit, isolation, and internalized restriction that decades of family life had created. By the time they were old enough to legally act independently, the patterns were too deeply established to break easily. When John died 2 years later, in November 1914, the question shifted from whether the remaining sisters might marry to what would happen to the vast property empire they had helped guard so carefully for so long, to whether the isolation that had characterized their adult lives would continue even after the brother who enforced it was gone. Josephine Jane Wendell, one of the middle sisters, died in the spring of 1914, leaving an estate valued at approximately $3 million to her surviving siblings. Her death reduced the number of Wendells by one, continuing the gradual attrition that would eventually leave the entire fortune to a single heir. A few months later, on 30th November 1914, John G. Wendell died at the Fifth Avenue house after a brief illness, his death marking a significant transition in family dynamics and property control. The Real Estate Record and Guide, a publication that tracked major property holdings and estate valuations in New York, estimated John's estate at $55 million, an enormous sum representing decades of patient land accumulation according to the Wendell family philosophy. A later commentator, writing in the Single Tax Review, a journal advocating for Georgian economic principles and land value taxation, emphasized that the Wendells had become extraordinarily rich not through active development or improvement, but through a simpler strategy: buy land and buildings, take the rents to pay taxes and buy more land and buildings, live inexpensively, and never sell. The analysis captured the essential Wendell approach: passive accumulation that relied on New York's growth to generate value, minimal reinvestment in property improvements, and frugal personal spending that ensured maximum capital available for additional purchases. The strategy worked spectacularly well in a city whose population, economy, and real estate values grew exponentially throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries. Property purchased for thousands in the 1850s was worth hundreds of thousands or even millions by 1914, requiring no action from owners except patience and payment of property taxes. Under John's will and New York inheritance law, control of the consolidated estate passed primarily to Rebecca, now Rebecca Wendell Swope by virtue of her marriage, while Mary Eliza Astor Wendell became financial executive for the sisters remaining in the Fifth Avenue house. The division of authority was pragmatic. Rebecca held legal title to much of the property, but Mary, living in the family house and unmarried, could manage daily affairs and coordinate with property managers, accountants, and attorneys who handled the actual business of rent collection, tax payment, and estate preservation. When Mary Eliza died on 22nd September 1922, aged 83, her will explicitly continued the family policy of keeping holdings intact. She left her share of the estate to her three surviving sisters, Rebecca, Georgiana, and Ella, with instructions that mirrored previous wills and reinforced the pattern of sibling inheritance that prevented property from dispersing to other family lines or outside individuals. The will, preserved in probate records and later examined by the New York Times and other publications, reflected the same philosophy that had governed Wendel finances for 3 generations: consolidate, preserve, never fragment the estate through sales or distribution to multiple heirs outside the immediate sibling group. The result of this multi-generational strategy was deeply paradoxical. The women who technically owned some of the most valuable real estate on Manhattan Island, commercial buildings in Midtown, residential properties throughout the city, land that was generating substantial rental income, continued to live in a house that lacked basic modern conveniences. No electric lighting, relying instead on gaslight that cast dimmer, yellower illumination and posed greater fire risk. No telephone, requiring them to communicate with the outside world through written correspondence or messengers. No modern heating system, leaving upper floors cold and uninhabitable during winter months. The contrast between their paper wealth and their daily living conditions struck contemporary observers as bizarre, evidence of either admirable frugality or pathological miserliness, depending on the observer's perspective. Critics suggested that John's control had extended beyond his death through the patterns he established and the psychological constraints he had imposed. The sisters, having lived for decades according to his rules, seemingly could not imagine alternative ways of life even when he was no longer present to enforce those rules. Legal ownership of property did not translate into freedom of movement, experience, or even basic comfort. The architecture of the estate, both literally in terms of the buildings they owned and figuratively in terms of the legal structures governing inheritance and control, kept them in place as surely as any barred window or locked door. They possessed millions in assets but lived like people of modest means, wore outdated clothes, shopped for bargains, and occupied a diminishing portion of their own house as building systems failed and were not replaced. As the 1920s progressed and the city's skyline rose around them with Art Deco towers and modern office buildings replacing the brownstone mansions of earlier generations, the number of Wendels in the old brick house dwindled and their isolation became nearly complete. By the late 1920s, Rebecca Wendell Swope had died in 1930, and only Ella and Georgiana remained at 442 Fifth Avenue, 2 elderly women in a house designed for a large family, living on income from one of Manhattan's greatest property fortunes while the building itself decayed around them. Georgiana, now in her late 70s, died of pneumonia on 18 January 1929. Her death became public knowledge only when her sisters filed for administration of her estate, following the family pattern of minimizing public involvement even in death. No obituary appeared in major newspapers at the time of her death. She passed quietly, privately, her funeral presumably as restricted as her life had been. Only later, when property transfers and estate administration required legal documentation, did public records confirm what had happened. For a woman who had once sued her brother, fled to Europe, and fought for years to establish her independence, the final silence was complete. On 20 July 1930, Rebecca Wendell Swope died, leaving Ella Virginia Von E. Wendell as the sole surviving sibling and the last holder of the family fortune accumulated over 3 generations. Newspapers noted with some astonishment that Rebecca's will left everything to her 80-year-old sister, with nothing at all left to charity, a detail that reflected both the family's intense focus on keeping wealth concentrated within the sibling group and perhaps also their isolation from the broader social networks through which wealthy families typically develop charitable commitments and institutional relationships. Reporters and curious neighbors observed Ella only rarely during her final year as sole occupant of the house. She appeared usually after dark, when streetlights cast long shadows and neighboring buildings' windows were dark, walking in the overgrown side yard with her French poodle, Toby. The dog became, in contemporary accounts and later retellings, a symbol of Ella's isolation. A widely repeated line from Drew University magazine's profile called Toby the only living creature that was close to the last holder of the Wendel fortune. The image is both poignant and revealing. An elderly woman, heir to millions, accompanied only by a pet as she takes her evening exercise in a neglected yard, unable or unwilling to venture beyond her property walls even for simple walks. The shutters that had once shielded a large family, parents, 8 children, and whatever servants and staff shared the household, now framed a single figure, her nightly circuit of the yard, both habit and boundary, a ritual that marked the limits of her world. Neighbors who occasionally glimpsed her reported that she appeared frail, her clothing decades out of fashion, her demeanor suggesting someone who had long since stopped engaging with the world beyond her immediate domestic space. The house itself showed signs of neglect, paint peeling, shutters in disrepair, the yard increasingly wild as vegetation grew unchecked. Yet taxes were paid on time, rental properties throughout the city remained under professional management, and the fortune continued to generate substantial income that Ella apparently had little interest in spending on either household improvements or personal comfort. By this point, Ella had lived in the Fifth Avenue house for her entire life, 80 years of occupation, watching the street outside transform from residential boulevard to commercial corridor, watching neighboring mansions demolished and replaced with office towers and shops, watching the world change while her own life remained fixed in patterns established half a century earlier. The house had been built when she was an infant. She would die in it as an elderly woman without ever having lived anywhere else except for seasonal moves to Irvington and Quogue that simply transferred the same restrictions to different buildings. The psychological impact of such limited experience is difficult to reconstruct from external observation. Did Ella experience her life as tragically constrained, a waste of wealth and opportunity? Or had decades of isolation made the familiar house feel safe, the restricted routine comforting, the absence of social demands and expectations a relief rather than a deprivation? The documentary record provides no clear answer, only external observations that suggest a woman who had accommodated herself to extreme limitation, who had made a kind of peace with the life circumstances John's rules and her own choices or inability to choose differently had created. What is clear is that by the time Ella inherited nearly everything, property, investments, rental income totaling millions annually, what she possessed most completely was solitude. The fortune that could have bought houses anywhere, travel to any destination, entrance into any social circle that wealth could access, instead funded the maintenance of walls, the paying of taxes on properties she never visited, and the preservation of a single house that had become less home than monument to a family whose defining characteristic was its absence from the world around it. Ella Virginia Von E. Wendel suffered a stroke in early March 1931, an event that in most wealthy households would have meant immediate summoning of doctors, nurses, perhaps removal to a hospital for specialized care. But the Wendel house had no telephone, required messengers to bring medical help, and followed patterns of privacy that complicated even medical emergencies. By the time adequate care could be arranged, several days had passed, and Ella's condition had deteriorated significantly. She died in the Fifth Avenue house on 13th of March 1931, age 78, in the same rooms where she had been born and spent her entire life. The New York Times covered her death with the mixture of fascination and calculation that had characterized coverage of the family during their later years. The paper noted that the real estate accumulated in the name of Wendel is now valued at more than $100,000, and the only living creature that was close to the last holder was a French poodle named Toby, a line that captured both the extraordinary scale of the fortune and the pathos of Ella's isolation, reducing her final relationships to a single animal companion whose name the Times misspelled, getting even that small detail slightly wrong. In accordance with family custom and John G. Wendel's longstanding dislike of public display, there was no mourning crepe hung on the door to announce a death in the house. None of the traditional Victorian and Edwardian signals that neighbors and passers-by would recognize as marking a household in grief. The funeral, when it occurred, was private, restricted to whatever few people still maintained contact with the family. Its details not published in newspapers that had to rely on property records and probate filings to reconstruct the story of the Wendels' final dissolution. Under the terms traced through genealogical research and institutional records at Drew University and other repositories, the Fifth Avenue property and other holdings ultimately passed to Drew Theological Seminary, now Drew University, which received substantial portions of the estate as Rebecca's and Ella's wills directed. Other beneficiaries included Lutheran churches and charitable institutions, reflecting Rebecca's marriage to a Lutheran clergyman and perhaps her influence on later estate planning. The distribution followed complex legal paths through probate courts, but the fundamental pattern was clear. With no direct descendants, the fortune flowed to institutions rather than individuals. In 1933, a bronze plaque was installed on the site, initially on the Wendel house itself, though this would need to be moved multiple times as buildings were demolished and replaced. The plaque's text, preserved in photographs and institutional records, stated in measured formal language, "Upon this site for more than 70 years stood the home of John D. Wendel, Esquire." After noting the sequence of family members who lived there, it concluded that following the deaths of Rebecca and Ella, the property passed by will to Drew Theological Seminary. The inscription recorded facts, names, dates, institutional transfer, while remaining silent about the lives lived within the house, the isolation that characterized those lives, the restrictions that shaped them, and the human cost of the accumulation strategy that made Drew University one of the wealthiest seminaries in America. The bronze surface reflected passers-by without revealing what the Wendel sisters had experienced, what they had wanted, or what they had sacrificed. The house that had resisted change for decades, that had remained architecturally and technologically frozen in the mid-19th century while Manhattan built upward and modernized around it, was demolished by 1934. An Art Deco Crest 5 and 10 cent store replaced it, bringing the retail commerce the Wendels had spent their lives avoiding directly onto the site of their former home. The Crest building would itself eventually be demolished, replaced by a modern glass and steel office tower that bore no trace of the mansion except for the periodically relocated bronze plaque. The fortune survived the sisters who guarded it. The house did not. What remained fixed across these physical transformations was not the brick and mortar, not the specific architectural presence, but the story itself, the narrative of 7 sisters who owned vast property while living in increasing isolation, who possessed wealth without freedom, who spent their lives behind shutters they or their brother kept closed against a world that might have offered them alternatives to the circumscribed existence they knew. In the end, the clearest portrait of the Wendel sisters may be the space where they are absent. A vacant lot in 1934, then a store, then a bank tower, each replacement marking how completely they had been erased from the physical landscape they had technically owned. Only the plaque, moved from building to building like an artifact of a vanished civilization, insists that they were here, that their lives occurred, that the house stood and families lived within it, even as it offers almost no information about who those people actually were or what their interior experience might have been. By the time a New Yorker in the 1970s or 1980s looked up at the modern office tower occupying the northwest corner of Fifth Avenue and 39th Street, the Wendel Mansion had been gone for decades. The Art Deco Crest building that replaced it had itself been demolished, superseded by the contemporary architectural values of glass curtain walls and international-style corporate towers. The bronze plaque that once marked the Wendel house had been moved from the demolished Crest building to the new structure, where it remained as a small metal rectangle of text, noting that something of historical interest had once occupied this valuable Manhattan corner. Behind the inscription lay the archive, wills leaving property to her three sisters, specifying that the estate should remain intact across generations. New York Times sketches noting that, of social life, the old house has absolutely none, quantifying the isolation with the precision of documentary observation. Drew University archivists cataloging 70 boxes of family papers, correspondence between attorneys, obituary clippings, business records tracking rental income and property taxes, legal documents recording the slow concentration of wealth as siblings died, and the fortune passed to fewer and fewer hands until only Ella remained. In those archival files, the sisters appear and vanish through signatures on legal documents and brief references in correspondence, but almost never in their own narrative voices. There are no diaries preserved, no letters expressing personal feelings or recording daily experience, no memoirs or autobiographical writings that might have provided direct access to their subjective experience of isolation, wealth, and constraint. They exist in the archive primarily as legal entities, property owners, testators, plaintiffs and defendants in court cases, rather than as full human beings with complex inner lives. Where shutters once filtered the avenue's light, carefully controlling how much of the outside world could observe the interior and how much those inside could see of the street beyond, curtain walls of glass now expose everything to view. The modern building's facade is transparent, revealing offices and workers to anyone passing on the sidewalk or looking from neighboring structures. The contrast could not be more complete. From a house designed to prevent observation to a building whose design assumes and welcomes visibility, from architecture of privacy to architecture of display. The movement from drawing a curtain against prying eyes to a glass facade that reflects the city back on itself traces more than a shift in architectural fashion or building technology. It marks the passing of a particular form of wealthy family power, one that expressed itself through withdrawal rather than display, through the ability to refuse social engagement rather than the need to demonstrate status through visibility. The Wendel's power was negative, the power to say no, to decline invitations, to close doors, to keep their wealth private rather than public. That form of power required specific historical conditions. A moment when wealth alone was sufficient to command respect without requiring social performance to validate it, when family privacy could be maintained against growing public curiosity and institutional oversight, when women's legal subordination to male family authority was taken for granted enough that even egregious isolation could persist for decades without effective intervention. All of those conditions were already eroding during the Wendels' lifetimes and would largely disappear in subsequent generations. The final image, then, is simple but resonant. A passerby pauses before the relocated bronze plaque, stopping briefly to read the engraved text while traffic reflects distorted in the polished metal surface and in the glass tower rising above. For that moment, while attention focuses on the words, the remembered house exists again, not as physical structure, but as historical trace, as story, as the intersection of documented fact and imaginative reconstruction. And with the house comes the women who lived inside it, called into temporary existence by the act of reading and remembering. They appear as historical figures whose lives were documented, but whose experiences remain largely opaque, whose choices and constraints are matters of archival record, but whose feelings about those choices and constraints went mostly unrecorded. They exist in the space between what sources tell us happened and what we can only infer or imagine about what it felt like to be them, living those particular lives under those particular restrictions. The shutters are long gone, demolished along with the house they protected. The sisters are gone too, their graves marked, but their full stories never fully told, because so much of what would make those stories complete was never written down, never preserved, never considered important enough to document when measured against the property records and financial ledgers that legal and institutional interests required maintaining. What remains is the question the plaque cannot answer but inevitably raises: whether the life the Wendel sisters lived represented a privilege of wealth that allowed them to refuse social demands and live according to their own preferences, or a prison constructed by family authority and internalized constraint that prevented them from imagining or pursuing alternatives to the isolation that defined their existence. The documentary evidence supports both interpretations without conclusively resolving either, leaving us with paradox, ambiguity, and the silence of shuttered windows that no archive can fully penetrate or illuminate.